Welcome, investigators. We are skipping the small talk today because we're jumping straight into a true crime explainer unlike any other. We aren't tracking down a bank robber or a mastermind cat burglar. No, we are investigating the greatest unsolved mystery in everyday finance, the complete evaporation of your purchasing power. I'm your lead detective, and together we're going to crack open the case file on the Great Wealth Heist.
And I'm your partner on this case, so let's kick things off with a million-dollar question. Where exactly did your money go? Seriously, have you ever noticed how your savings account kind of feels like a leaky bucket? You work hard, you deposit your paycheck, the balance just keeps going up, and yet, somehow, you can buy less and less with it every single year. It's time we examine the evidence.
Okay, let's open the case file. Section 1, the crime. Vanishing purchasing power. People usually see inflation as a natural disaster, just this unavoidable force of nature where the cost of living magically goes up. But the evidence actually points to an active structural wealth transfer. The trick is the difference between nominal value and real value. Nominal value is totally surface level. It's the paper illusion, the raw numbers printed on your bank statement. But real value? That is the harsh mathematical reality of what those numbers can actually buy. If your investments are growing, but your currency is shrinking at the same time, those paper gains are literally just a mirage covering up a crime scene. Right, which brings us to the psychological blindfold that makes this entire heist possible. The money illusion. It's this wild cognitive bias where we only see the face value of our money. Behavioral studies show this perfectly. If you get a 2% pay cut when there's zero inflation, you feel totally cheated, right? But if you get a 2% raise while inflation is roaring at 4%, you actually feel pretty good about it, even though the mathematical theft to your purchasing power is exactly identical in both scenarios. It is the perfect cover.
Moving on to Section 2, the weapon. Diluting the pizza. So how is this value actually extracted from your pocket? It all comes down to currency debasement. It's an old tactic. Think Roman Empire mixing cheaper metals into their gold coins. Today, think of the entire economy as a giant pizza. Central banks and commercial banks are constantly creating new money. But here's the trick. Printing new money doesn't magically bake a bigger pizza. It just slices the exact same pizza into smaller, thinner, less valuable pieces. Central banks do this by printing base money. That's primary seigniorage. Then commercial banks do the real heavy lifting, creating roughly 97% of the money supply simply by issuing loans. That's secondary seigniorage.
Exactly, and that leads us to our primary suspects and a phenomenon known as the Cantillon effect. When new money is created, prices don't just instantly go up everywhere at once. It takes time. So the first people to get their hands on the new money, banks, governments, large corporate borrowers, they get to spend it at the old low prices. But by the time that money finally trickles down to everyday wage earners and retirees, prices at the grocery store have already shot up. The early recipients capture all the value, while the late recipients are stuck paying the inflation tax.
Which brings us to Section 3, the motive. Debtors and banks. Now we have to ask, why do central banks explicitly target a 2% inflation rate? It wasn't some grand scientific master plan. It actually originated accidentally in New Zealand in the late 1980s from an offhand comment on TV. To institutions and banks, a little bit of inflation is considered a good thing. It keeps credit flowing and slowly erodes the real burden of the debts they hold. But for the average person's savings account, it's devastating. Look at the math. At a low 2% annual rate, prices double roughly every 35 years. That means for someone with a 40-year career and a 25-year retirement, this stable 2% rate will quietly destroy more than 70% of their wealth's purchasing power over their lifetime. A tiny bump to 3.2% means the cost of living doubles in just 22 years.
This exposes the ultimate motive. Inflation is essentially a massive, arbitrary redistribution of resources. The systemic losers are net savers, retirees, people on fixed incomes, conservative bondholders. But the systemic winners? Heavy borrowers. And who, you might ask, is the biggest borrower in any economy? The government. Inflation acts as this brilliant, soft default, allowing them to pay back their massive debts with dollars that are worth significantly less than the ones they originally borrowed.
And they enforce this through something called financial repression. Get this statistic. Since 2010, the U.S. federal funds rate has been artificially suppressed below the rate of inflation more than 80% of the time. This basically guarantees a negative real return on safe cash. Everyday savers are effectively forced to subsidize the national debt because their savings are being slowly, invisibly liquidated.
Moving to Section 4, the trap. the treadmill illusion.
So, monetary dilution is bad enough, right? But the tax code turns this into an outright psychological trap for everyday workers. See that 1.5%? That represents the chunk of GDP extracted through bracket creep. Imagine you're on a treadmill. You get a 5% cost of living raise to match 5% inflation. You are running faster just to stay in the exact same place. Your real purchasing power hasn't changed at all. But the government doesn't adjust the tax brackets at the same speed you're running. So your shiny new raise pushes you into a higher tax bracket. You end up paying more taxes on the exact same real income, slowly sliding backward off the treadmill.
It's wild. And this trap extends to your investments through what we call phantom gains. Let's say you make an 8% return on a stock, but inflation was 6%. Your real gain is basically under 2%. But guess what? You are taxed on the full 8% paper gain. When inflation is high, your effective real tax rate can easily skyrocket to 84%, or even well over 100%. The government is basically taxing your principal, but they've disguised it as a capital gain.
All right, Section 5, collateral damage, businesses and insurance.
This heist doesn't just target individuals. Businesses get caught in the crossfire too, mostly through accounting subterfuge. Under standard FIFO accounting, first in, first out, businesses match their old, low historical costs against their high current revenues. This creates massive paper profits that the government is just eager to tax. But to restock their shelves today, the business has to pay the new inflated prices. So they get taxed on profits that don't actually exist in real purchasing power, invisibly draining their productive capital base.
And for homeowners, there is a terrifying hidden vulnerability here, the underinsurance crisis. Your insurance policy is based on a nominal dollar limit, but as inflation drives up the real cost of timber, steel, and skilled labor, your coverage falls dangerously behind. Recently, valuations were estimated to be 15 to 30% behind actual replacement costs. If a disaster strikes, coinsurance penalties kick in, and you could face a catastrophic, permanent loss of wealth simply because your safety net was rendered obsolete by the money printers.
Finally, Section 6, the defense, shielding your wealth.
So, how do we actually fight back? How do you construct a defensive architecture against this persistent inflation tax? The goal here is to completely escape the nominal paper traps by shifting your strategy to real assets. We're talking about assets with intrinsic utility or inflation-adjusted cash flows. Commodities, which often spike when prices rise. Residential real estate, which benefits from the replacement cost effect. TIPS, Treasury inflation-protected securities. And equities in companies that have the pricing power to just pass those higher costs right back onto the consumer. When you look at the historical rap sheet, the evidence is absolutely clear. Take the high inflation 1970s. Nominal stocks and bonds looked okay on paper, but in real purchasing power terms, they were heavily negative. Physical assets like gold, however, were up over 21% in real terms, and real estate held its ground beautifully. We're seeing those exact same patterns emerging again in the 2020s. Real assets maintain their actual value when paper currency is being diluted.
So to summarize your ultimate survival checklist, first, real after-tax benchmarking. Always, always judge your returns after inflation and taxes. Never fall for the nominal mirage. Second, asset-debt alignment. Use fixed-rate debt to buy real assets, so you become the one paying off loans with cheaper dollars. Third, dynamic risk management. Constantly update your insurance replacement value so you aren't caught off guard. And finally, fiscal insulation. Use tax-advantaged accounts to shield yourself against the taxation of those brutal phantom gains.
So, the absolute crucial takeaway is this. Surviving the 2% target requires a complete rejection of nominal metrics. You must audit your own financial crime scene. Are your investments actually protecting your real purchasing power? Or are you just sweating it out, running faster and faster on the nominal treadmill? It's your wealth. Make sure you aren't the victim of the great heist. Keep investigating and